My name is Julia Madera. We're at Perry Junior High, and today is February 1st, 2010. Could you please state your name for our records?
Alva, Forsberg, Cerri.
I'm just going to start with some basic questions. What branch did you serve in?
I was an Army nurse, and the last year and a half I was Army Air Force. At that time, the Air Force was part of the Army.
How long did you serve?
Lacking 1 month in 4 years.
When you were serving, what was your highest rank?
First lieutenant.
And did you receive any decorations or medals?
Well, that one reason I was a little lucky, I brought this. And EAME, the 3 ribbons, 3 battle stars, although I wasn't in the battle, and 5 for overseas service bars.
How did you get the bars?
The length of time we were overseas.
I'm going to ask some questions about your daily life and what you did when you were serving. What was your daily life like?
Well, it varied. When we went to Fort Sill, we expected to go there, and we thought we were going to be shipped to the Pacific immediately because the Japanese had bombed Hawaii and captured the Philippines. So anything to do to whip the Japs, as they were generally referred to back at that time, we would. Well, we ended up sitting at Fort Sill for a good 9 months. And finally, when we got on a train to head for the Pacific, we headed the other direction. And in Fort Sill, we had good conditions. After that, it varied tremendously.
When you say it varied, what do you mean from?
Well, when we were in England waiting to go to North Africa, we lived in houses that had been for more or less slum clearance, I believe. We didn't have much heat, not much hot water, but not bad compared to what we had later on. When we landed in North Africa, first we were put up in some villas that looked beautiful when you looked at them from the distance. But we were packed in there and probably had 2 or 3 hours of running water in the evening. And then they needed it for nurses that were going to work in a station hospital, I believe, near there. So they moved us over to the area where the men had been put up in tents and pup tents and had hospital tents for us. And even though it was just tents, it was an awful lot better than the villas. And then when we finally set up our hospital near Constantine, we had tents, 2 per tent, and they were reasonably comfortable. And then when we moved to Italy, we took over one of Mussolini's hospitals, and we had the living quarters where probably the nuns had lived, I don't know. But there were at first 7 of us, later on 6 of us, to a room. And we didn't have much more than a bed and a little stand by our bed that was probably made out of shipping crates. But we did have a bathroom directly across the hall with hot and cold running water in a bathtub.
What were your general duties?
General taking care of patients. In North Africa, well, at Fort Sill, we helped because the staff were short-staffed, so we helped their hours on urology. And it was fairly similar to hospitals in Utica area, except the wards were very large, except a couple of smaller rooms. Very similar to Rhodes Hospital in this area. And in North Africa, there were just a few constant buildings for the sickest patients and surgery and a few such things. I had 17 patients to a tent, and I had 2 tents that I took care of in the daytime with 1 ward boy in each one. And at night, there were about, I forget whether 5 or 6 tents that I was responsible with 2 ward boys. In Italy, we had one huge ward for dermatology patients, and the end of the thing had double and private rooms for contagion, and outside were a couple of tents for the boys that were in with what we called VD then. It was SDI now. And now we had to give them the medications. Other than that, we didn't do anything for them. They had to take care of themselves. Back then, the only venereal diseases that I knew of were gonorrhea and syphilis.
Before you left, was there any training you received, or did you receive on-site training?
We had to be licensed RNs to go in.
I'd like to talk about people that you met and the memories that you made. How were your officers?
Well, every one of our doctors are volunteer officers. Some of them may have had their draft deferred so they could join us. Quite a few of them were, I would say, past 35. Several of them were old enough to be my father. And I knew the chief of surgery and the chief of orthopedics from the hospital where I took my training. We had very good officers. It could very well be compared to, for the military, it could very well be compared to upstate medical, because a lot of them were affiliated with the University of Minnesota.
How were your doctors?
Well, that's the ones I was really talking about. I didn't have much to do with the other officers. The administration was in a separate building, so I rarely had anything to do with them.
Is there a person you're going to remember most?
Well, of course, my husband.
Yeah. You said he was the off-limit sergeant. Can you tell me about that?
Well, I met him at Fort Sill, and he was drafted in the second draft with about 250 New York boys, and they were sent to San Antonio for about 6 months of spiritual training. He was trained as a surgical assistant for the operating room. There were others that were trained for lab technicians, x-ray, different fields in the medical field. And then he was sent to the hospital where I was working, and he used to pick up patients and bring them back to the wards. And we got acquainted, and things clicked. And of course, I was not supposed to be dating a sergeant.
That's so sweet. Was there anything you saw that left a great impression on you?
Well, actually, we were a little surprised when we landed at Iran. The city looked gorgeous from the ship. But when we got up close, the buildings were cracked and bad disrepair, shortage of water. Kids were not very well dressed. I saw one little kid wearing a girdle upside down as a dress. But the most worst one was the night after we arrived in Bari Harbor. We arrived there on December 1st in '43. And December 2nd, they bombed the Bari Harbor and sunk just about everything that was in the harbor, including 2 tankers with fuel and a ship that had nothing on it but about 100 tons of mustard gas, along with our supplies and a lot of things. And even though it was not publicized at the time, I think that was a reason why the war lasted so long on the West Coast, because the Air Force did not have the fuel supplies and or probably the ammunition, and it did blow out some windows in the front of our hospital, although we were probably about 2 miles away from the harbor.
Wow. In the form that you filled out, you mentioned your roommates. What were your roommates like?
Very good.
What made them so good? Were they friendly?
Well, they were decent kids. One of them had been in one moved out shortly after we were in Italy. She moved in with a close friend of hers. The oldest one had been a country school teacher and decided to go into nursing because she wanted to be a missionary to China. One of the others, who had her bachelor's and RN, had been a public health nurse. Two were very close friends from their training days, and they were both ministers' daughters. And the Evie was a replacement that had come in North Africa, and she was the only kid from Brooklyn along with a bunch of Minnesota people. Wow. And she ended up later in life as a midwife down in Kentucky.
There were a lot of things that went on in this war. What were some of your reactions and thoughts, such as what were your general thoughts about the war?
Well, we thought it was necessary. We did what we could. We worked 12-hour days, 1 day off a month. And it wasn't easy, but we did it because we thought we had to.
Where did you hear about Pearl Harbor?
Well, I was working night duty at the time, and my roommates came home on a Sunday afternoon and told me Pearl Harbor had been bombed. At the time, I really didn't think I was going in, but it wasn't more than a couple of weeks after that I decided to join. And probably part of the reason was I was brought up on a farm. I had one brother. I knew my dad could not run the farm if he had been drafted. So I decided I'd go in. And every time he went in, they said, do you have a brother in the service? And he said, no, but I have a sister.
What was your reaction to the use of the atomic bomb?
Well, our unit had been broken up. We'd been replaced by the 45th General Hospital, except that was administration and doctors. We were still there as nurses. And we were anxiously waiting to go home because we'd been overseas 33 months. And then we were informed, don't get too anxious. We're going to the South Pacific. The next day, they dropped the bomb, and that was hallelujah.
So you thought it was necessary?
Oh, the death rate would have been horrendous if we had invaded.
Mm-hmm. How did you feel on VE Day?
Happy.
Good.
We were finally going to go home.
I'd like to talk about some of the medical situations. Were there any supply shortages?
In North Africa, they, of course, were working to try to get the people back to work as quick as they could. So priority for penicillin, which had just come on the market, went to the ones with gonorrhea and syphilis. And it was very difficult to get it. We had the sulfa drugs for the infections, but we were a bit unhappy that we could not get penicillin. We had makeshift there. We had a tap with cold water. We had a 3-burn kerosene stove that we heated our water on. And we put patients to work because I could not take care of approximately 34 patients, one-on-one care. But patients stayed there until they were back on duty. So if a patient came back from surgery, I'd assign somebody who was reliable to stay with them.
Did you ever have to evacuate?
No, I was in a large hospital, so we did not.
Were you in any medical situations that required quick thinking?
Not really, because we were given, well, there might have been some situations, but nothing outstanding.
I'm going to talk about your life outside of nursing. What did you do for entertainment while you were there?
Well, they did have movies and entertainment. And as I said, I was not supposed to be dating Sergeant Cerri. So we went on a lot of hikes and bicycle rides and whatnot. saw quite a bit of scenery and such in England because it was quite easy to take a bus.
Yeah. How did you keep in touch with those at home?
Via mail letters. Phone calls were completely out. We couldn't have afforded those.
How did the men in your hospital treat the women?
I only had one peculiar situation. It was shortly after Sicily had been invaded, and I believe he was a paratrooper. I came in the morning and all the beds were filled. And no, this was North Africa. And my regular ward boy had been taken to be what they call a litter bearer on the front lines. And I had been given Sully, who was the outfit's alcoholic. And he'd been given the choice of joining the military or going to jail for something he had done. So he was on the cleanup detail, but they gave him to me as a ward boy. So I taught him how to take temperatures and do a few things. And he'd come in the morning, and I might put a couple Band-Aids on him and give him an aspirin or two, and he'd get to work, and we got along real well. Well, this morning we came in and came to this very vulgar guy. And it just happened, Sully happened to come up to me at the time, and I said, finish taking the temperatures here, I'm going to go see what I have in my next tent. And I just happened to be right across from his bed where I could hear. And I heard Sully going over him, and not the nicest language, but he didn't realize that I was within hearing distance. And you never talk to any of our nurses like that, because they're ladies. When I came back in the tent, he apologized. Never had a better trouble with him. Well, my regular ward boy came back, and the first sergeant said he's coming back tomorrow. And I said, can I keep Sully? And he was absolutely shocked, but of course, I had to take the regular one back.
Now, I want to ask you about the story. Nancy Hartman told me part of it. It was about something about you, the women, not getting the recognition that somebody else did. What was that story?
Well, we were, when I went in, the women nurses had been in service since way back in the Florence Nightingale days, but probably not officially. But I believe they were in the Civil War. And they definitely were in World War II, because the 26th General Hospital was in France during World War II. But we were relative rank, so we were not supposed to associate with enlisted men. Probably it was originally for our protection. Well, the unit that I went in had a lot of nurses that had their 5-year degree from the university. That was their BS and RN, and had worked as public health nurses, school nurses, supervisors and such, and still went in with the same rank as I had, which was second lieutenant, and I had just graduated 6 months prior to that. We were getting $70 a month, while male officers and WACs and waves were getting $120. It wasn't until the summer of '45 where we were finally given full salary, which would hold till 6 months after the war finished. Then we would go back to the regular pay. Well, Truman corrected that in '48 when he made nurses par with any other person in the service. And not too long after that, they would be, I believe, started as first lieutenants and get to be captains fairly soon after that.
Okay, so it had to deal with the rank and the pay, and wow.
And we did not get the recognition. Actually, there was a nurse that was discharged who had been a POW in Manila for 3 years. And she had been in for 30 years and was discharged as the second lieutenant.
That was the one that Nancy was telling me about. Wow. amazing. Now, you have some stuff written down. Are there some stories that you want to share that you wrote down on your notebook paper?
Well, one was they had reminded us that if an enlisted man was caught on a ward where he wasn't assigned, he would lose his stripes and we would be transferred to some other unit, which would be front line, which would have been pretty rough. Well, that one day I was told to go off about 3 o'clock because I wasn't too busy. Someone had been admitted to the nose and throat ward next to me that had been shot through the jaw. And they thought if they could save him for a couple of days where he'd have to be watched and suctioned. Apparently in the daytime a patient could help with that. But at night they needed someone to stay with him. Well, Sergeant Cerri happened to be working operating room that night, so of course he came down to see if I needed anything. And Major Hilger, who was his doctor, came in to see him. And we were standing around the bed talking, and the night supervisor walked in. She was a friend of mine. And she looked at us as much as to say, you know what my orders are. And finally, Major Hilger got through, and he slapped Sergeant Cerri on the shoulder and said, "Come on, Sarge, let's finish our rounds."
So almost caught.
If it hadn't been for a good doctor, the doctors didn't care.
Right.
It was just our top one who was regular Army. But later on, he was replaced when we were in Italy. And the CO that we had at that time actually okayed a couple of what we called then mixed marriages.
Oh.
So they were not that strict towards the tail end.
So now, you know what we missed out on hearing was the progression of from when you enlisted to like where you went from there, you know, and so forth and so on.
We went to Fort Sill, sat there waiting to go to the Pacific, we thought. On Columbus Day, we packed up and got on the train. We went to New Jersey for about a week. Got on the Mariposa, which had been a luxury liner in the South Pacific for 500 people. Well, they packed 5,000 of us on it, and I don't think they really used very good judgment. There were 3 general hospitals, station hospitals, field hospitals, and 1 small field artillery unit. Had we gone down, I don't know what they would have done for medical personnel. Well, we left New Jersey in a convoy. We woke up in the morning and we were all by ourselves. And they said, we'll pick up a convoy in a day or so. Well, that was not in the plans. We zigzagged across the Atlantic till we landed at Liverpool. And then we went up to Fiji Farms, which was north of Birmingham. Not the greatest place in the world to be in the wintertime. They did give us permission one day. Half of our unit went to London. Well, the day I went there, you could hardly see across the street. So I have been to London. I have not seen it. The next day, the other half of the unit went and had a beautiful day. Well, we were scheduled to go in to North Africa as soon as the ships came back from the invasion and would pick us up. Our supplies had gone down, and we lost them. And probably some other hospital got them. And so we were alerted a couple of times, but we finally left England in early February and landed at Iran, and then went by train, which was slower than a Pony Express. If some of the guys got off to buy a bottle of wine or something and the train went off without them, they could walk behind and catch up to it before the next station, because supposedly the local people had to investigate the tracks to see that they were safe. Well, then we landed, we got to a little town north of Constantine, and they had cleared a wheat field, and the engineers were busy pouring concrete for all our tents. And our tents were set up. We did not have concrete. We had dirt floors for the 9 months we were there, but it was okay. And only trouble is, they'd piped in water from springs that were fairly near there and put a little wooden silo on top of a little hill above where our tents were. So that was our water system. And of course, when it was 110 plus degrees, that water was really too hot for a shower. And when it was cold, it was a pretty cold shower. You got out of there pretty quick. But one of the funny things was when we moved over to where the men were in near Oran, they had blinds around with no roof on it. And the fighter pilot flyboys discovered there were nurses there, and they'd come over that shower tent pretty low. We were a bit annoyed by that.
Oh, because they were open air.
Yes.
Okay.
I don't think they could see a thing, but it bothered us.
Oh, how funny.
Because they'd be going over there pretty fast.
So then, when were you discharged then?
I was discharged. One thing I didn't add was that when we were on the side that was under English control on the grounds, but the 15th Air Force was there. And when the Germans finally surrendered northern Italy, we got some Russian patients in who had been told, you shoot the limey in front of you or you're going to get shot from behind. So they finally surrendered. And when they came into our hospital, they were terrified at the horrible treatment they were going to get from us. But they were put in with the regular patients. And we did have a few patients that could speak a little bit Russian, so we needed some information. So the 15th Air Force offered to fly them back to Moscow, and they refused. And when they left, they actually cried because they said they had been in American hands and knew what treatment we actually gave them, so they expected to be shot and dumped in the Brenner Pass. And we had 2 fairly advanced TB patients that could never have taken several thousand miles in a weapon carrier.
Wow. Amazing. Now, what do you have any other things you want to share that you wrote? Because you wrote down a couple pages.
Well, the 26th General Hospital was officially closed on June 21st, 45, and the 45th replaced us until we completely closed in early September. There were a few nurses left behind when I left. But I took a plane from Naples to Casablanca, and from Casablanca I came back to the States. And I was discharged officially on September 25th in 45. But I had vacation pay that held until the end of January.
Wow. So you went to Casablanca.
Yes.
Was it wonderful there?
Well, the first few days, I stayed at the hotel where the Big Three had their conference. It was for majors and up, but they were short of space for nurses. So I was put in so except for the one who was chief of the operating room, we had to move down to a hotel that was run by the Americans, but in Arab section, and was very badly run. And there's something I didn't intend to put into this, but my roommate became ill. And she was in the station hospital, which was about 6 blocks away. And at 10 o'clock at night, we got a call that we were to be ready to be picked up at midnight to take a plane. And so I called. I had never called for transportation. And I called, told them what I needed. Well, they didn't have a card. Finally, the lieutenant called back, And he said, a French mechanic has finished repairing the car. If you don't mind a mechanic driving, I'll send him over. And I said, well, I don't speak French, so tell him where I'm going. Well, we started out towards the station hospital, and then we turned. And I tried to get him to go back, and he appeared to not understand any English and didn't want to understand any English. Finally, we were in the outskirts of Casablanca, and I'm getting terrified. I saw a T intersection coming up, and I had my hand on the door, and I thought, I'll take a leap out the door when he slows up for this intersection. But we had passed an MP station a couple 100 feet off the highway. Dear Lord, please help me. And just before we came to the intersection, an MP Jeep came alongside us, and I screamed for help, and they pulled in front of us. Suddenly he could talk some English. We were headed for the city dump. So I woke up my friend at the hospital and said I had to hurry because the MPs were waiting for me. And she was sedated and didn't have any idea what in the world I was talking about. And my friends were standing out in front waiting for the bus to pick them up because it was getting to be about 11:30, and I'd been gone for a good hour. And so the lieutenant called, and he wanted to know if I wanted to stay and press charges. And I said, he only took me for a joyride. That's all I could get him for. But when they stopped us, well, anyway, at that time, I was so glad to be going home that I didn't even have the sense enough to get the name of the two wonderful young MPs that helped me. And they said they'd been sitting behind the station all evening, but there had been men that had been known to be carrying money that had been picked up with their heads bashed in the dump. And that was the only thing out that direction. But I was so glad to get out of there, and inside of 2 hours I was on a plane, so it actually did not have a lasting effect on me.
Wow. Except that you had two guardian angels around you.
I had two guardian angels, and an answer to about their shortest prayer I ever heard. But I wish I would find somebody who was in Casablanca in September or October of '45.
Well, that would be a good mission to go on.
I think it might have opened where they were looking, and I personally think the lieutenant was involved.
Wow.
That would be a very easy pickup. Somebody would call that it had a little bit too much to drink, get a ride home, and send a car out.
Well, with modern technology, you might be able to find somebody that was there.
Well, my technology is the TV and the phone.
Well, these two are very adept, so
Well,
we'll have to
they
put them on a
see
mission.
if they can find somebody that was there in September and October of '45.
Now, what about you coming home and getting married? How did that all happen then?
Well, of course, we'd planned this ahead of time.
So, real quick, how long had you dated in
From Fort Sill.
Okay.
So it was over 3 years.
Okay, so the whole time then. Did he get discharged at the same time you were discharged?
Well, that's another very peculiar one.
Okay.
When he was sitting at Naples, he was sent back to detached duty to work on cartoons because he had very few cartoons made at that time. So he spent just about a month that he was supposed to be ready to come back. Well, about a week before I left Naples, he left and he was going by a ship. And so when I got home, I called, and his sister said, he isn't home yet. And I said, where is he? And I said, he left before I did. Well, the last I heard from him, he was in Brazil, in Rio. And what in the world is he doing in Rio? Well, there were a few Brazilians that were sent over to help fight the war, which apparently is quite debatable what help they were, because the English had to clear out a area of Rome while the Brazilians recaptured it, so they could take nice pictures. And I had known him for over 3 years, and he had never done KP as a staff sergeant. And they had picked about 20 sergeants and 1 corporal to do KP for the Brazilians. And when they landed at Rio, their commanding, the ship's captain, told them that they could have a day's shore leave, and then they were going to Recife to pick up supplies, and then go back to Marseille to pick up troops to take to the South Pacific. And of course they complained they wanted to get back to the States. And he said he didn't give a GD what they did. They could call the president as far as he was concerned. Well, the corporal, fortunately, his father was the top assistant to Senator Taft, who was the top Republican at that time. And of course, he told Truman. And when they landed at Recife, a 1-star general came on board, and they said, who gave them permission to call the president? And they all said, you did, sir. And he said, I did not. And so they repeated what he had said, and they had a C-47 waiting for them to bring him back to the States. But that never made the news back in those days.
I'm sure that was very hush-hush.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
There were a lot of things that were
Yeah.
hush-hush. The bombing of the Bari Harbor raid. I talked to somebody that was in charge of a port near Casablanca, and he had never heard of it.
Wow.
But mustard gas. But I think that mustard gas explosion might have been what kept Hitler from using it.
So then you got discharged. He came home.
So we got married on November 3rd.
And when were you
45.
discharged again?
I was discharged in Fort Sheridan, Illinois.
Okay. So what was the time frame then? You got married November 3rd, and
Yeah.
when were you home then? Like right away?
Well, I went home right after I was discharged on September 25th,
Okay.
in 45.
Okay.
And I went home to Minneapolis with several of the nurses that I took the first train ride down to Fort Sill. So we had been together. We were actually one big family the entire time. We had a few replacements, but as far as the nurses were concerned, there were not many replacements.
Well, what a fun story. Very neat.
Of course, in the history book, it refers to officers and nurses. It doesn't refer to us as officers. Of course, we did have, excuse me, dietitians, physiotherapists, and back then, one interesting thing is, Sister Kenny had come to Minneapolis General in either 39 or 40, because she had been a sister, more or less missionary, in the outback in Arizona and Australia. And she'd called headquarters there to ask what to do with polio. And they said, well, really, they don't know much, just give them the usual treatment. Well, Dummy didn't know the usual treatment. So she hot-packed and massaged. And she came to the United States to talk to the AMA, and the only one who'd listened to her was a doctor from Minneapolis General. He said, we've had 80% paralysis. We can't do any worse. Because back then, put them in splints and casts. So when I had to affiliate at Minneapolis General for contagion, which fortunately you don't have much anymore, they were using the hot packs and massage. And we had the same physiotherapists in the 26th General Hospital as they had in Minneapolis.
Wow.
And in 50, Utica had a polio epidemic, and two of the orthopedic doctors went to learn a new technique.
Oh my goodness. Wow. Well, these have been awesome stories. Is there, before we end, is there anything else that,
Well, this is
I feel like we could sit here for
this
hours.
is off the record now. You got that thing.
You wanted to turn it off?
I don't know.
Pause.
We're,
Uh-oh. Wait, we better not, we don't want to use this now, because I don't want to be taping over